On January 18, 1991, at 6 in the morning, the sun rises over an unrecognizable Iraq, one where Baghdad smolders beneath dozens of columns of black smoke, rising from ruins that just yesterday were command centers, air bases, and power plants, and are now nothing more than twisted wreckage. In underground bunkers, Iraqi generals desperately try to understand what has just happened, but they can't, because communications have been completely and utterly destroyed, and the reports that do manage to get through are fragmented, contradictory, and absolutely terrifying. And then they hear the sound they will hear every damn day for the next 5 weeks. That distant roar of jet engines approaching again, like a wave that never stops crashing into the shore. The storm isn't over, not even close, because what's coming will be even more devastating than what they've just lived through. Act the Scud Hunt, the Invisible War. It's 3 in the morning on January 18th when, in Tel Aviv, the sirens blare again for the third time in barely 24 hours, and Israeli families bolt out of bed and sprint into sealed rooms, pulling on gas masks with trembling hands. Because everyone remembers perfectly well that Saddam used poison gas against the Kurds in Halabja in 1988, killing 5,000 people in a single day with chemical weapons. The question no one dares to say out loud is simple and horrifying. Will he do it now, against Israel? 8 Scud missiles hit Israel on the first day of the war, triggering mass panic in Tel Aviv and Haifa. And now more are falling out of the night sky without warning. The real problem, the one keeping military planners awake in Riyadh and Washington, isn't the physical damage these missiles cause, because the truth is they're fairly inaccurate and primitive, 1960s technology that rarely hits what it's trying to hit. The real problem is political, and it has the potential to blow up the entire international coalition. If Israel responds militarily to these attacks, the Arab coalition fractures instantly, because Saudi Arabia and Egypt simply cannot be in the same military alliance as Israel attacking an Arab country. That's basic political survival in the Middle East. Schwarzkopf, fully aware of the catastrophic strategic implications, orders what will become the most frustrating operation of all Desert Storm: the Scud Hunt, an effort that will divert massive resources, including some of the coalition's most advanced aircraft, to chase mobile targets the size of trucks across an area the size of Belgium. The Great Hunt in the Western Desert. 120 F-15E Strike Eagles, advanced fighter bombers, each worth $60 million, are immediately pulled from strategic missions and reassigned to patrol relentlessly over western Iraq, in what frustrated pilots quickly start calling the Scud Box, a vast, empty 29,000 square kilometer desert where they search desperately for mobile Scud-Tel launchers that could literally be anywhere. It's like trying to find specific needles in a haystack the size of Belgium, while the haystack shoots back at you constantly. And to make it worse, the entire search happens at night, in pitch black darkness, where the only way to see is through infrared systems. Major Randy Begum, a veteran Strike Eagle pilot with over 1,000 flight hours, flies at 15,000 feet over the western desert, methodically scanning the endless terrain through his sophisticated infrared lantern pod, hunting for the telltale heat signature of a Scud teal. But after hours of mind-numbing patrol, he sees nothing. Nothing but miles of cold sand and rock. Then, at exactly 2:34 a.m., after 4 hours in the air, Begum spots something that spikes his pulse. A bright dot moving slowly along a secondary road in the middle of nowhere. He radios in, possible Scud at grid November, Victor 325, investigating. He drops aggressively to 5,000 feet as the dot gradually resolves into the unmistakable silhouette of a large truck with the distinctive shape of a mobile tail launcher. His heart hammers as he shouts, "Tally, Visual confirmation, Scud Tel, requesting clearance to engage. His WSO works fast to laser designate the target, while Begum lines up the run. Clearance comes instantly. Cleared to engage, weapons free. Begum presses the release. A 500-pound laser-guided GBU-12 falls silently, then strikes dead center with a massive explosion, because the Scud missile was fully fueled, and the propellant detonates at once, creating an orange fireball that surges 300 feet into the air. Begum yells triumphantly, "Splash 1 Scud! Secondary explosion confirms it was legit." But what Begum and the other pilots don't know is the scale of the problem. For every Scud they find and destroy, 10 or 15 slip away undetected. The Iraqis learn incredibly fast, developing more and more sophisticated tactics. They hide TELs carefully inside highway tunnels during the day, move only at night, use elaborate decoys, modified fuel trucks that look identical to real TELs from the air, and disperse launchers intelligently across remote farms, under bridges, and in dry wadis where they're practically invisible. Over the following weeks, the F-15Es methodically destroyed dozens of vehicles, but many turn out to be decoys. Some are real TELs, but it's impossible to know which is which until after impact. Pilot frustration grows exponentially with every mission that ends without a clean result, while Scuds continue to fall relentlessly on Israel and Saudi Arabia. The desperate fix, special forces. But the coalition has a hidden ace. British SAS and Delta Force teams infiltrate quietly into Iraqi territory with a clear mission: find Scuds on the ground, call in airstrikes on them, and occasionally destroy them themselves. On January 22nd, an 8-man SAS team identified as Bravo 20 infiltrates near the main Baghdad-Jordan highway. Their mission: observe Scud traffic and cut communications lines. Everything goes wrong from the start. They're spotted by a local shepherd on day 1, making contact inevitable. They are forced to move on foot 300 kilometers toward the Syrian border in the dead of winter, with temperatures dropping to -15 Celsius. They realize with horror they don't have enough water for a trek that long, while they're hunted relentlessly by thousands of Iraqi soldiers and local militias who know the terrain better than they ever could. For 7 nightmare days, they move mostly at night, drinking from contaminated puddles, eating almost nothing because their rations run out after 3 days, fighting brutal cold that freezes their gear solid, while extreme exhaustion makes every step heavier than the last. 3 operators are eventually captured alive after desperate firefights in which they burn through every round of ammunition. 1 man, Vince Phillips, dies tragically of severe hypothermia during a freezing night. 3 more manage to break away from the group. 2 are eventually captured, but 1, Chris Ryan, pulls off the nearly impossible, walking 300 kilometers completely alone and crossing into Syria after 7 days with no food and nowhere near enough water, surviving on puddles and whatever he can find to eat. It's one of the most epic evasions in special operations history, and Ryan will later write a bestseller about it. Other teams, however, are far more successful. Delta Force operators work quietly, establishing camouflaged observation posts on hills overlooking major roads, watching patiently for days to catch a teal on the move. SEAL teams operate closer to the coast, monitoring suspicious facilities. Together, these ghost teams identify 29 active launch sites, provide exact GPS coordinates, and call in airstrikes that F-15Es execute precisely, destroying 12 confirmed TLs based on intelligence from teams on the ground. Scud launches gradually decrease, from 8 or 10 missiles a day at the start to just 1 or 2 per week by late February. The launchers are never completely wiped out. Some teals always remain hidden, but the threat is dramatically reduced. Israel, in a near miraculous act of restraint unprecedented in its modern history, never responds militarily, despite the 42 Scuds that ultimately strike its territory. US-deployed Patriot missiles managed to intercept some Scuds in flight, although the debate over their true effectiveness continues decades later, with studies claiming success rates ranging from 90%, per Pentagon assertions, to under 10%, per later analyses. When the war ends, the final tally is revealing. 42 missiles fell on Israel, causing mass panic, but only 2 civilians killed directly, while 46 fell on Saudi Arabia, including the deadliest strike when one hit barracks in Dhahran, killing 13 US service members instantly and wounding 99, the highest casualties from a single attack in all of Desert Storm. Act 2, absolute control of the sky, days 315. It's January 21st, exactly 4 days since the war began, and the Iraqi Air Force, once considered the 4th largest in the world, has effectively stopped fighting for real. The math is brutal. In 96 hours, they've lost 42 aircraft without shooting down a single coalition plane in air-to-air combat. Every time they take off, they die. But some Iraqi pilots are still brave or desperate. Lieutenant Commander Mark Fox is calmly flying his FA-18 Hornet on a strike mission against an ammunition depot when his radar picks up a contact. A MiG-21 closing at supersonic speed with hostile intent. Fox is loaded with bombs for ground attack, but with the flick of a single switch, he instantly shifts to air-to-air mode. He gets a radar lock in seconds and fires a Sidewinder that rockets off the rail. The MiG tries desperately to evade, pulling brutal Gs and dumping flares. But the modern missile simply chases it relentlessly, ignoring countermeasures until it hits, turning the fighter into a fireball that tumbles down into the desert. Fox doesn't pause to celebrate. He switches right back to bombing mode, continues to the target, completes the strike, destroying the depot in a massive explosion, and returns to his carrier without a scratch. Air-to-air and air-to-ground in the same sortie as if it were the most normal thing in the world. That's the new reality of modern combat, and it's something the Iraqis can't match. The Great Flight to Iran. But Saddam Hussein has a desperate plan. Save what's left of his air force by sending it to Iran, his mortal enemy until just 3 years earlier, after a war that lasted 8 years and killed more than 1 million people. It's absurd, but it's his only option. On January 26th, the mass exodus begins. Dozens of Iraqi aircraft flee east in scattered formations. MiG-29s, MiG-23s, Mirage F-1s, Su-24s, even massive Il-76 transport planes loaded with valuable equipment and personnel Saddam can't afford to lose. They fly dangerously low, under 100 feet above the desert, trying to slip beneath AWACS radar coverage that constantly monitors the skies. And astonishingly, many make it across the border and land at Iranian bases. US AWACS controllers detect the escapes almost immediately and vector F-15C Eagles to intercept when they can. Captain Rick Tolini manages to intercept and shoot down a giant Il-76, an easy target that likely carried evacuating personnel, and Tolini will feel uneasy about that victory for the rest of his life, because shooting down a fleeing transport aircraft doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like an execution. Other pilots face the same moral dilemma, and some deliberately allow certain aircraft to escape, deeply uncomfortable attacking targets that are clearly running. In the end, 148 Iraqi aircraft escaped to Iran, more than half of Saddam's remaining operational force. Tehran officially interns them under neutrality laws, but with a smile it never returns them, shrewdly keeping nearly $2 billion worth of military hardware as war compensation for the conflict Iraq started against them. Saddam effectively loses his entire air force without the coalition having to destroy it outright. Handing it, involuntarily, to his worst enemy in a twist, historians will study as a perfect case of unintended consequences. Day 8. Khafji, the desperate counterattack. It's January 29th when, after a week of being hammered without being able to respond, Saddam orders his only significant ground counterattack. Seize the small Saudi border town of Khafji, inflict visible coalition casualties, and prove Iraq can still fight. It's a disaster from the start. At 8 at night, 3 Iraqi armored columns, 2,000 soldiers and 80 tanks, crossed the border simultaneously and managed to occupy Khafji, a city evacuated days earlier. The tanks barely have time to settle in before FA-18 Hornets and A-6 intruders on patrol pick them up immediately on infrared sensors. And within minutes, the deadly A-10 Warthogs dive onto Khafji like hungry sharks. The Battle of Khafji becomes a brutal demonstration of what happens when ground forces try to operate under a sky completely dominated by enemy air power. Captain Paul "Yogi" Johnson flies his A-10 at 8,000 feet over Khafji, watching with perfect clarity as tank columns move through the streets. He drops aggressively to 4,000 feet, and the legendary 30mm Gu-8 Avenger cannon in his nose roars, firing 3,900 rounds per minute of depleted uranium, each round capable of punching through tank armor. Johnson holds the trigger for 2 seconds, sending 130 rounds sweeping across the Iraqi column. A T-55 erupts into a violent fireball as rounds penetrate the turret and detonate stored ammunition. Another tank grinds to a dead stop, black smoke pouring from every hatch as its crew tries to scramble out. Johnson hauls back on the stick, pulls a tight turn that crushes him under 4 Gs, and runs in again as more A-10s join the methodical destruction. From higher altitude, FA-18s drop cluster bombs that burst in mid-air, scattering hundreds of submunitions across huge areas. And through the night, AC-130 Spectre gunships circle overhead, firing 105 Meeporn shells that turn night into day with each blast. Saudi and Qatari forces counterattack on the ground on January 31st, supported by US Marines. But everyone knows the real work is done by air power that never stops striking. In 36 hours, the invasion is shattered. More than 50 tanks destroyed, hundreds of vehicles burned out, 300 to 500 Iraqi soldiers killed. Coalition casualties, 43 dead, including, tragically, 31 in a single friendly fire incident when a Maverick missile mistakenly hits a US armored vehicle in the confusion of night fighting. Khafji is a tactical coalition victory, but a public relations disaster for Saddam because it proves to the world that his army cannot operate under skies controlled by the enemy. Act 3. Methodical Destruction. Days 1630. It's February 4th, and the strategic air campaign is officially complete. 157 command centers destroyed, 268 radars turned into scrap, 140 SAM batteries eliminated, 38 airfields damaged. Now comes Phase 2, battlefield preparation, meaning the destruction of the Iraqi army in Kuwait. 500,000 Iraqi soldiers are dug in behind massive defenses, miles of interconnected trenches, reinforced concrete bunkers, extensive minefields, multiple layers of barbed wire, huge trenches that can be filled with oil and set ablaze to create walls of fire. The Republican Guard is held in reserve to the north, ready to counterattack. Schwarzkopf orders the Box, a 200-kilometer zone where coalition air forces will systematically bomb every Iraqi position before the ground assault. B-52 Stratofortresses, 8-engine giants that have served since the 1950s, fly 60 missions a day. Each aircraft flies from Diego Garcia on a 16-hour round trip with multiple refuelings, dropping 51 500-pound bombs onto trench lines. It's carpet bombing with modern precision. Iraqi soldiers who survive will describe it as living through an earthquake that never ends, hour after hour, where you can do nothing but pray the next bomb doesn't land on you. The A-10 Nightmare, armor destruction. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, nicknamed the Warthog for its ugly look, slow but nearly indestructible, was designed in the 1970s for one purpose: killing Soviet tanks in Europe. Now it does exactly that in the desert. Captain Eric Fish Salomonsson flies his A-10 at 10,000 feet over Kuwait when he spots a convoy of 15 armored vehicles moving along a road. He dives to 2,000 feet, and the GAU-8 cannon, literally larger than a Volkswagen Beetle, erupts with violent force, shaking the entire aircraft. Depleted uranium rounds punch through a BMP, which explodes violently, flinging debris in all directions. Salomonsson banks for another pass. Then anti-aircraft fire opens up. Tracers streak past. Explosions rock the aircraft. "I'm hit!" he shouts, checking his controls. Everything still works because the A-10 was built to take punishment. Redundant systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, a titanium-armored cockpit. It can lose an engine, half a wing, and keep flying. Salomonsson continues the attack, destroying 4 more vehicles before breaking off. He lands with 37 shrapnel holes in his plane. The ground crews repair it all in 18 hours. He flies the exact same mission the next day. The A-10s fly 8,624 sorties during Desert Storm, destroying roughly 1,000 tanks, 2,000 other vehicles, and 1,200 artillery pieces. Only 6 A-10s are shot down, a survival rate of 99.93%, which is extraordinary given how low and dangerous their missions are. Act 4, the highway of death and the end. It's February 26th. The ground war, which began 72 hours earlier, is a total triumph, beyond anyone's expectations. The Iraqi army is collapsing as Schwarzkopf executes his plan brilliantly. While Marines and Arab forces stage a feint toward Kuwait to draw attention, the massive 7th Corps and 38th Airborne Corps swing a gigantic left hook through the western desert, encircling the Iraqi army and severing its retreat routes in a perfect pincer movement. Terrified, demoralized Iraqi troops, after weeks of constant bombardment, flee desperately toward Basra along Highway 80, taking everything they could loot from Kuwait: luxury civilian cars, overloaded trucks, even shopping carts filled with TVs and appliances. War booty they're trying to haul home. FA-18 Hornets, A-6 Intruders, and F-15E Strike Eagles patrolling the area find them. And what follows is a systematic slaughter. Aircraft employ a tactic of first destroying vehicles at the front and rear of the column, trapping everyone in the middle with no escape, creating what planners call a kill zone. Then they methodically strike the trapped convoy. Cluster bombs detonate over hundreds of vehicles. Thousands of soldiers abandon their rides and run into the desert, but many die in follow-on attacks. Hundreds of vehicles burn at once, sending black smoke pillars visible from 100 kilometers away. At dawn, photographers capture images that will become iconic and deeply disturbing. Miles of destroyed, burned-out vehicles, charred bodies, apocalyptic devastation stretching to the horizon. The footage hits televisions worldwide that night and the phrase "highway of death" locks in the horror. The moral debate ignites immediately. Is it legitimate to strike a retreating army? Or is this a massacre? Legally, it's entirely legitimate. A retreating army is still a combatant force until it formally surrenders under a white flag. And these troops weren't surrendering. They were escaping with weapons and equipment. But the images are brutal. Bush, worried about global perception, orders a ceasefire just 24 hours later, ending the ground war after exactly 100 hours. Day 38, The end and the numbers. It's February 28th at 8 in the morning when President Bush officially declares a ceasefire. Desert Storm is over. 43 days of air war, 100 hours of ground war. The numbers Schwarzkopf presents are staggering. The coalition flew 109,176 total sorties, dropped 80,500 tons of bombs, fired 288 Tomahawk missiles, and destroyed more than 3,700 tanks, 2,400 armored vehicles, and 2,600 artillery pieces. Coalition casualties, 182 dead total, 147 in combat, and 145 in accidents, 776 wounded, 75 aircraft lost, 42 shot down in combat, and 33 in accidents, and 23 helicopters lost. Most striking of all, 0 aircraft lost in air-to-air combat. For Iraq, the numbers are devastating. An estimated 20,000 to 50,000 military dead. The true figure will never be known with certainty. 75,000 wounded, 86,143 captured as prisoners, more than 324 aircraft destroyed, 3,100 tanks lost, and between 2,300 and 3,500 civilians killed. It's the most lopsided victory since World War II. Act 5, the legacy that changed war Desert Storm, revolutionized modern warfare in ways we still feel 3 decades later. The stealth era had arrived. The F-117 Nighthawk flew less than 2% of total sorties, but destroyed more than 40% of high-value strategic targets without losing a single aircraft in combat. It proved radar invisibility wasn't science fiction, but real, usable, military capability. Every nation with serious military ambitions immediately pursued its own stealth programs. The B-2 Spirit, F-22 Raptor, and F-35 Lightning II are direct descendants of those lessons. Precision munitions changed everything. 80% of laser or GPS-guided bombs hit their targets, compared to barely 5% in Vietnam, a 16-fold improvement. GPS, laser designation, and inertial navigation turned bombing from an imprecise art into an exact science. Today, unguided bombs are the exception. Information dominance, AWACS flying constant patrols, J-STARS tracking vehicles, satellites taking high-resolution imagery, and data links tying everything together in real time gave the coalition a god's-eye view of the battlefield. Iraq fought blind, while the coalition saw everything and could strike it immediately. That information advantage was as valuable as any physical weapon. Joint operations, air, land, and sea, operated as a seamlessly integrated system like never before. The concept of joint warfare, where every service branch works in tight coordination, became core doctrine taught at every Western military academy. Psychological effects. 38 days of sustained bombing shattered the will to fight long before the ground war began. When tanks finally rolled in, 500,000 soldiers surrendered with minimal resistance after weeks under relentless air attack. Yet despite this crushing military victory, Desert Storm did not bring the lasting peace everyone expected. Saddam Hussein remained in power for 12 more years, using what remained of his forces to brutally massacre Kurds in the north and Shiites in the south, who rose up believing the United States would support them, but the support never came, and thousands died in bloody reprisals. Economic sanctions continued throughout the decade, and UNICEF reported that more than 500,000 Iraqi children died from lack of medicine and nutrition. A number, fiercely debated, but one that undeniably points to massive civilian suffering. The underlying tensions were never resolved, only postponed. And in 2003, the United States returned in a second war that toppled Saddam but unleashed more than a decade of insurgency, sectarian civil war, and instability that cost hundreds of thousands more lives. Some veterans still wonder whether the coalition should have marched to Baghdad in 1991 and finished the job, while others argue just as fiercely that the mission was solely to liberate Kuwait, and that pushing to Baghdad would have shattered the coalition and turned a swift victory into an open-ended occupation with no clear end. The debate continues, with no real consensus. The lives behind the numbers. Tate, the F-15C pilot with the first air-to-air victory, flew 42 missions during Desert Storm. His jet never took a scratch. He retired as a colonel with more than 4,000 flight hours. What we did in Desert Storm proved that technology and training can minimize the cost of war. Not eliminate it, but minimize it. Cody, who led the Apache strike that opened the war at 2:38 a.m., rose to 4-star general and became Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. Those 4 minutes defined my career. We knew that if we failed, hundreds would die behind us. We didn't fail. Peters and Nicholl, the British Tornado pilots shot down and captured, were tortured for weeks. They appeared on Iraqi television with faces badly beaten. Their families saw them on the news. They survived and were released after the war. Neither ever flew in combat again. Nicholl wrote Tornado down about the experience. Peters suffered severe PTSD. Both live, quiet lives in England, far from war. The members of Bravo 20 met different fates. Chris Ryan wrote bestsellers about the failed mission, which became required reading in Special Forces schools. Other members disputed the story, fueling controversy that lasted for decades. The Ummah, 3 who died, Vince Phillips, Stephen Lane, and Robert Concilio, are buried with full military honors. The 7-person B-52 crew that took off from Louisiana completed its 35-hour, 14,000-mile mission, setting the record for the longest bombing mission in history, a record that still stands. In Washington, D.C., there was no Desert Storm Memorial even 30 years later. It remained the forgotten war between Vietnam and Iraq 2003. Veterans pushed for decades, and in 2024, the construction of a modest memorial near the Lincoln Memorial was finally approved. Veterans say they're not chasing glory, just recognition. 292 Americans died. 776 were wounded. It deserves to be remembered. The final lesson. Desert Storm proved that high-tech warfare can work brilliantly, but it also exposed its fundamental limits. You can destroy an entire army in 100 hours with minimal losses. You cannot build a lasting peace in 100 days, or 100 months, or 100 years. Saddam finally fell in 2003, not because of air power, but because of a massive ground invasion and years of bloody occupation. Iraq today remains fractured and weak, still struggling for stability. Maybe the real lesson is that war, even the most efficient, clean, and rapid war ever fought, doesn't solve the underlying political problems. It only postpones them for future generations. On January 17, 1991, 1,000 aircraft darkened the skies over Iraq. For 43 days, the storm roared without mercy. And when it ended, the world had fundamentally changed. War had changed forever. But the human problems that caused the war, ethnic and religious tensions, territorial disputes, the ambitions of dictators, were still there, waiting to explode again. This was the complete story of Desert Storm, the storm that changed war forever, proving that superior training, cutting-edge technology, and perfect coordination can dramatically reduce the human cost of war. In 1943, 308 airmen died over Ploiești in a single catastrophic mission. In 1991, 147 coalition troops died across 43 full days of war. The difference represents 48 years of extraordinary technological progress, revolutionary tactical development, and obsessive preparation. But war is never without cost. And Desert Storm taught us that even the most perfect victory leaves unanswered questions and unresolved problems that will haunt the nations involved for generations.